Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Let's go. Hi, guys. Third Samnite War Part 2. I would recommend watching Part 1. Either the original video or my reaction to it. Did I say the original link? Top description Discord link? If I didn't, I said it again. Let's go. Ready to learn. If you are not, you know the drill. Well, you're in the wrong class. Let's go. Battle of Sentinum, 295 BC. Clash of the Five Nations. Roman Republic?
After years of bitter conflict between Rome and the Samnites, the climactic battle of the Third Samnite War was about to take place. Upon its outcome rested the fate of Italy. Under the leadership of General Gallius Ignatius, the alliance of Samnites, Senonian Gauls, Etruscans and Umbrians arrayed upon the famous field of Sentinum. Across the field, consuls Decius Mus and Fabius Maximus observed this sizable host. They were clearly outnumbered. But then, according to legend, a galloping deer emerged onto the battlefield from the hillside forest, chased by a wolf. Amused by the spectacle, the Gallic contingent unleashed a few volleys of javelins and spears. Clearly, the two beasts alleviated some of the tension felt by the troops. The wolf ran to the side and away from danger, but the panicked deer turned towards the rain of projectiles. As it approached the Samnite battle line, it was slain by the troops from the Gallic contingent. Meanwhile, the Romans opened a way for the wolf to pass safely through their ranks, for the wolf was sacred to the god Mars. This was an occurrence of dire portent to their enemy. Encouraged.
I thought he was going to say because of how the whole Roman, Romulus Remus wolf thing.
By this occurrence of dire portent to their enemy. This was an occurrence of dire portent to their enemy. Encouraged by this sign, the Romans advanced.
Portent? A sign of warning that something, especially something momentous or calamitous, is likely to happen. Literary and exceptional, or one? Okay, so the first. Okay, understood. Like an omen.
But before we continue, I want to shout out today's sponsor, Established.
Guys, always use the, in any video where there's a sponsor, always use the, their link. These people sponsor everyone lately.
Titles. Established Titles is a project based on a historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to as lairds, lords, and ladies.
Stretch.
What Established Titles does is give you 1 square foot of land so you can call yourself a lord or a lady, and provides you with an official certificate with a crest. Once you have your certificate, you'll have a unique plot number to see the exact location of your land. And by owning this land, Established Titles allows you to change your name to lord or lady on credit cards, plane tickets, or even dating profiles, and much, much more. Through doing this, Established Titles plants a tree with every order and works with global charities, One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future, to support reforestation efforts. And Established Titles told me that the first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my link will effectively be next to my plot, just a few minutes walk between each other. And depending on how many of you want to become a lord or lady, we can build our own little History Marsh kingdom. It makes an amazing last-minute gift, and Established Titles is actually running a massive sale. Plus, if you use the code MARSH10, you get an additional 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/marsh10 to get your gifts now, and help support the channel.
Hold on.
The consuls for the year 296 BC were Appius Claudius and Lucius Volumus.
Sorry, I had to even it out. Pay attention. Phone's
the
away.
consuls for the year 296
Even
BC
if you're watching
were
on one.
Appius Claudius and Lucius Volumus. Appius.
My God, I need to shut my mouth.
The consuls for the year 296 BC were Appius Claudius and Lucius Volumus. Appius was an ambitious politician who, as censor, had constructed the Appian Way, as well as Rome's first aqueduct. Volumus, nicknamed the Violent, had won a war against the Salentini, and while fearsome towards
The previous episode is coming back to me now. I remember what happened. And this is only a few decades after the death of Alexander the Great, right?
as well as Rome's first aqueduct. Volumus, nicknamed the Violent, had won a war against the Salentini, and while fearsome towards the enemy, was loved by Roman soldiers for his friendliness and generous distribution of plunder. With new armies in tow, Appius marched to Etruria with 22,000 troops, while Volumus commanded some 25,000 into Samnium, where he joined Fabius and Decius, who were retained in the field for 6 months as proconsuls. The three armies proceeded to devastate the lands of Samnium. Gallius Ignatius, the head of the Variani, a leading clan of the Samnites, understood that coping against 3 Roman armies was not possible. At a council meeting with other clans, it was decided that to achieve victory, they needed to cooperate closely with Rome's other enemies and divert Roman attention away from Samnium itself. Gallius was chosen to lead a major army beyond the frontiers. Commanders were further assigned to conduct a defensive war, whereby most of the remaining Samnite forces would be stationed behind the walls of their castles and strongholds. Seeking to join forces with most of the remaining commanders were further assigned to conduct a defensive war, whereby most of the remaining Samnite forces would be stationed behind the walls of their castles and strongholds. Seeking to join forces with the Etruscans, a people rich in money and manpower, Gallius's army marched north into Umbria. In Samnium, with no enemy army to oppose them, the Roman generals shifted their focus from ravaging the countryside to attacking walled positions, capturing several towns and cities over the coming months. Meanwhile, the Etruscans had mustered an army and joined the Samnites under Gallius. Umbrian tribes joined in, and attempts were made to hire Gauls as auxiliaries. This coalition inflicted several defeats on Appius, who lost the confidence of his troops. Realizing the need to spread out Rome's forces, Consul Volumus ordered Fabius to march into Lucania, where he was to stamp out a pro-Samnite faction from fully forming. Decius was to remain in Samnium, while Volumus himself marched to Appius's assistance. Appius resented receiving help from his colleague, but under pressure from his own officers, he agreed to cooperate. Volumus challenged and engaged the Etruscans, and his reluctant colleague then followed suit, marching his army against the Samnites. The Samnites joined battle without waiting for Gallius, who was absent on a foraging expedition. The Roman armies drove back the enemy. Later in the battle, Gallius's cohorts arrived and briefly re-galvanized the coalition army. But the Romans
They started without... Okay.
eventually forced the enemy from the battlefield and captured their camps. The coalition lost 6,900 dead and 2,120 captured. Back south, a newly raised Samnite army crossed the border and began a campaign of devastation in Campania. Volumus hurried to Samnium, since the proconsulships of Fabius and Decius were about to expire. But upon learning of the raids in Campania, he diverted his army to intercept the Samnites. He caught up with them as they were crossing the Volturnus River. However, as the year 296 came to a close, fearful news reached the Romans of developments in the north. Gallius's defeat had led him to take his diplomatic efforts
Question? So we refer to this as 298 BC, 297 BC, right? Whatever, but what did they refer to their time as? Like, did they have a year like we do, or did they not just, like, did they call it the year of, like, blah, 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 instead of 295? You know what I mean?
More seriously. He brought upon to take his developments in the north. Gallius's defeat had led him to take his diplomatic efforts all the more seriously. He brought a powerful war band of Senonian Gauls into the field as mercenaries. Further Umbrian cities also joined the alliance. Now, a grand coalition of Samnites, Etruscans, Gauls, and Umbrians had mustered their forces in Umbria. This caused great alarm in Rome. At the start of 295 BC, Volumus was recalled to oversee the elections and advise on strategy. At his urging, the Centuriate Assembly elected Fabius as consul again, nearly a year after he held office. Ignoring the drawing of lots in assigning the fields of command, the Senate and Assembly decreed that Fabius should command in the north against the Samnite coalition, on the back of his successes against the Etruscans and Umbrians during the Second Samnite War. The Assembly also wished to re-elect the currently serving consul, Volumus, but this was near unprecedented. At any rate, Fabius prevented this, again requesting Decius as his colleague, citing their harmonious relationship. But just as Fabius marched out towards Etruria with reinforcements, news reached him that a legion under the command of Scipio at Camerinum had been nearly wiped out by the Senones. Meanwhile, Decius was assigned command in Samnium. Two additional armies under Postumius Megellus and Fulvius Centumalus were posted west and north of Rome to protect against a possible attack on the city. The unprecedented number of armies and magistrates with Imperium operating in 296 and 295 was a novelty for the Romans, which reflects the threat posed by the coalition formed by the Samnites. Once in Etruria, Fabius took over the army of Appius near Clusium. Here he received reports of a much larger Samnite coalition force gathering in Umbria. Alarmed by the dangerous situation, Fabius requested that Decius join him with his legions. Volumus's command was extended for a year as proconsul, and he made his way to Samnium with the 2nd and 4th legions. This was to deter the Samnites from reinforcing Gallius, and to encourage Gallius to send troops back to Samnium. A Samnite army attempted to block Volumus at Mount Tifernus, but the proconsul drove their force onto the mountain and assaulted their position, defeating and routing the enemy, despite the difficulty of the terrain. Meanwhile, in the north, Decius joined Fabius, and the two consuls marched their legions to the area around Sentinum. Upon sighting the enemy army, Fabius and Decius were hesitant about advancing into the open plain. With the Samnite army nearly twice the size of their own, the two consuls had every reason to be concerned. However, they soon learned from 3 deserters that the experienced Samnites and Senones formed the front battle line. Their plan was to attack and pin down the Romans. Had every reason to be concerned. However, they soon learned from 3 deserters that the experienced Samnites and Senones formed the front battle line. Their plan was to attack and pin down the Romans. Meanwhile, the Etruscans and Umbrians were to flank the Roman line and hit them in the rear. Wasting no time, the 2 consuls sent orders to the 2 smaller armies defending Rome, under Fulvius and Postumius, to march into Etruria and ravage the land as far as Clusium. This had the desired effect. The Etruscan soldiers at Sentinum refused to allow their homes to be plundered, and they departed for Etruria, taking the Umbrians with them.
Wow, that was
With half of the coalition force absent, Fabius and Decius sent their cavalry to harass the enemy, while advancing with the rest of the army into position. In an attempt to provoke them into giving battle, the Roman cavalry launched probing attacks, sweeping across the Samnite battle line and unleashing their javelins.
I get it, that the feeling, and it's hard to gauge exactly how much time is going in between, this attack and the retreat. But I understand that wanting to go, but it's the same army as this one, and so I feel like if there were cooler heads, they would have been like, these are the people sacking over there. It's not like you're going to get there, and so why not stay and defeat them? But I mean, it's easier said than done, and I get that.
However, Gellius remained on the slope above the battlefield and would not commit his troops forward. He decided to wait for his allies to return. But after 2 days of skirmishing, officers and troops within his army urged action, frustrated that they had to endure harassment from the Roman cavalry.
See, 2 days just passed. It's hard to gauge time.
Finally, on the 3rd day, both armies decided to do battle. The Roman army consisted of 4 legions and an even larger number of allied and Latin troops, including 2 large cavalry contingents and 1,000 hand-picked Campanian horsemen, renowned for their combat riding abilities. All told, Rome fielded some 38,000 men at Sentinum. The size of the coalition army is unknown, but it is described as being very large. It included Samnite cohorts, Gallic warrior bands, Samnite and Gallic cavalry, and a force of Gallic chariots in the rear. Considering that about half of their host left the field, it is safe to assume that the Samnite coalition was around 40,000 strong. Roman military doctrine was offensive, though on this day, Fabius erred on the side of caution, aware of the combat effectiveness of Samnite and Gallic warriors. Fabius advanced the 1st and 3rd legions, but restrained his men from charging the enemy. Decius, on the other hand, wanted to force a quick...
It's fascinating, and it's something that I really don't think about when factors going into how you structure your troops and do battle, how much it can change depending on the reputation of the opponent. It's something that's kind of obvious that it would affect it, but it just I don't think about it immediately, and clearly it has a large impact.
The enemy. Decius, on the other hand, wanted to force a quick victory. He assumed command of his cavalry and ordered the 5th and 6th legions to keep pace with the trotting horses. Once they closed the distance, the Roman left charged the Senones. Knowing that the Gauls were themselves notorious for being aggressive in the opening clash, Decius urged the men to drive the enemy back, seeking to quickly take the wind out of them. Meanwhile, the Roman right came into contact with the Samnites. Fabius believed from experience that the Samnites, while vigorous in the initial clash, would wear themselves out over time, so he ordered his legionaries to take a defensive stance and draw out the conflict. All across the battlefield, a stubborn battle developed between the opposing infantry. However, impatient with the lack of progress, Decius personally led the charge of his cavalry against the Gallic horsemen. The Roman horse swept them aside, and retaining their momentum, they crashed into the second line of Gallic cavalry. The push continued, but Decius failed to see the advancing Gallic chariots that were charging towards his flank. In pressing his attack this far, the consul was now at risk of being cut off.
How the chariots, usually the geography, the map detail is really accurate on History March videos, which is part of the reason why I love them so much, the videos. But, I mean, they're on chariots, and they're going through a wooded area, it seems, here. Which would seem...
The consul was now at risk of being...
I mean, maybe it's less dense wooded area. Okay.
In pressing his attack this far, the consul was now at risk of being cut off. The Roman cavalry on the left now came under heavy attack. Unaccustomed to the thunderous roar of chariot wheels, Roman horses became uncontrollable with fear. In a reckless panic, much of Decius's cavalry formation fell apart as the riders peeled off en masse and fled back towards the Roman side of the battlefield, with some crashing into their own infantry, throwing them into confusion. The Senones now seized the initiative. Gallic cavalry and chariots attacked the left flank of Decius's infantry. The Gallic infantry, seeing the Romans lose morale, renewed their attacks, refusing to give the legionaries a moment to restore order. Decius tried to stop the fleeing men and rally the troops, but at this point his army was at risk of collapse. With a look of determination, Decius took it upon himself to restore morale through the ultimate sacrifice, the Devotio, an act of ritualistic suicide in which a Roman general would fall to the enemy, dedicating his own life and the lives of his opponents to chthonic deities. As the battle raged around him, Decius remembered his father who died in 340 BC by committing Devotio during a battle against the Latins.
His dad died in battle 45 years ago? Why doesn't that quite make sense to me? Yeah. Oh, he's probably older than I think, okay.
Now, as his son who wore his father's military garb, Decius determined to follow in his footsteps. He had the pontiff Livius recite the words of the Devotio and transferred his authority to the priest. The consul then turned his horse towards the enemy and uttered the following imprecation. I carry before me terror and rout, and carnage and blood, and the wrath of all the gods, above and below. I will infect the standards, the armor, and the weapons of the enemy with dire and manifold death. And the place of my destruction shall witness the destruction of the Gauls and Samnites. With these words, Decius charged the Senones where their formation was most dense. Upon impact, he fell to a shower of missiles and swords. Witnessing this, Livius turned to the troops to advertise the consul's sacrifice, which inspired Decius's army to remain in the field.
I was just about to say, what was that?
But even more
That was like, dun-na-na, bum, bum, bum. Dun-na-na, bum, bum. Lord of the Rings. I was like, well, it was beautiful and everything, but couldn't you have used your suicide mission in a slightly more sneaky way so that you can kill more and then die in the process? But it seems like he just, literally just all right, I'm going to die, and just ran into spears is what I kind of pictured. But obviously the morale effect it's going to have when his death is said to the other troops has an impact.
Decius's army to remain in the field. But even more important was the cool-headed leadership of Fabius, who had sensibly kept reserves on standby under Scipio and Marcius. Although not yet aware of his colleague's death, Fabius could see that there was trouble on the left, and so he ordered half of the reserves to reinforce that part of the battle line. Seeing the approaching reserves brought new courage to the Roman left and forced the Senones onto the defensive. As the Senones formed a shield wall, legionaries gathered the javelins lying on the ground between the two forces and threw them at the enemy. Showing still more tactical preparedness, Fabius had avoided overcommitting his cavalry. While part of his cavalry cautiously skirmished with the Samnite horsemen, another part had been kept in reserve. Fabius could now see that his defensive approach wore down the enemy.
They needed those spears that broke on impact, the Samnites, so that... I know they don't have them now. I don't think even Rome has them right now. Who's that guy who introduced a lot of like new Roman warfare? I watched a video on him of like the Roman weapons we think about today. So yeah.
Fabius could now see that his defensive approach wore down the enemy. The Samnites had exhausted themselves, while the Roman legionaries still had energy and were eager to attack. Fabius ordered his embattled cavalry in the front to renew their push against the mounted Samnites, and his infantry to press forward and steadily dislodge the enemy. Seeing that the Samnites now offered weak resistance, the consul gave the signal to his cavalry reserve to sweep around and strike the Samnite flank, while ordering his remaining infantry reserves to reinforce his front line. The Samnites found themselves hard-pressed by the general Roman advance. Exhausted, they routed. Maintaining momentum, Fabius directed the Principes of the 3rd Legion to turn and assault the left flank of the Gallic line. Finally, he activated the Campanian horse, sending them to ride behind the Senones and attack their rear. Despite being flanked from the north, the Gallic infantry resisted vigorously. But eventually they were overpowered and forced to retreat. The fleeing soldiers were cut down as they tried to reach the Samnite camp. Men clustered as they approached the gates. Those who could not enter resolved to fight a last stand under the rampart. There they were cut down, among them General Gellius as well. Many Gallic fugitives were trampled by their fleeing comrades. By the end of the day, the Samnite camp was captured. The Battle of Sentinum was a particularly bloody affair. Decius and Gellius lay dead, and although only...
Oh my god, that's his helmet. I thought that was 3 arrows in his head.
1,700 of Fabius's men had been killed, Decius's army lost 7,000. However, the coalition's casualties were far worse, with 25,000 killed and 8,000 captured. Fabius gave a funeral for Decius and burnt part of the spoils as a sacrifice to Jupiter Victor.
What?
Funeral for Decius and 8,000 captured. Fabius gave a funeral for Decius and burnt part of the spoils as a sacrifice to Jupiter Victor. The Roman victory was soon followed by further...
It's like dumping out half your beer in respect... Oh, sorry.
...victories elsewhere. The Roman victory was soon followed by further victories elsewhere. 5,000 Samnite fugitives attempted to escape through the lands of the Paeoline, but they were intercepted by a local force and lost 1,000 men. Fulvius defeated a combined force of Etruscans from Clusium and Perusia, killing more than 3,000 of the enemy and capturing as many as 20 standards. Entering Etruria as well, Fabius Fabius slew 4,500 Perusians and took 1,740 prisoners. Most importantly, Appius took command of Decius's army and effected a junction with Volumus in response to Samnite raids on the lands of the Aurunci and around the Volturnus. In the Stellate Plains, the two generals won a major victory against the Samnite forces, killing 16,300 and capturing 2,700.
Wow. 19,000 casualties.
Through the strategic and tactical decisions of Fabius, the Romans had decisively defeated the coalition of 4 nations.
So that's got to be game over. Rome must conquer the rest of... I'd imagine it falls pretty fast to Rome after this.
The greatest threat yet posed to Rome's hegemony had been crushed. After such colossal efforts, the Romans would now settle for nothing less than the conquest of Samnium. The Samnites understood that their liberty was at stake, and they would fight on for another 5 years. But that is a story for another video.
Guys, do you think... Awesome video as always.
If you stayed around...
Do you think that had Rome not conquered the peninsula, then the Samnites or the Umbrians or Etruscans would have, and then you would have had a Samnite Empire or Umbrian Empire or Etruscan Empire? I'm assuming it was inevitable for one of them to conquer the rest, I'd imagine. Or maybe like a Samnite South. Like if the Romans were wiped out by the Etruscan, Umbrian, Samnite, the faction, right? I wonder how history would have been like a southern Samnite peninsula and northern Etruscan, Umbrian peninsula. Or do you think that maybe Rome was the only one who would have conquered the whole peninsula for itself and made an empire? I just wonder about that. Really cool. Hope you guys learned something or can teach me something down in the comments. Hit the subscribe button, all the good buttons, and I'll see you guys next time, all right? Bye, guys. Keep learning just keep learning, all right? Bye, guys.